I'm here today with Benjamin Rosenbaum and Jed Hartman. We are going to be talking about my co-host's book, The Unraveling. Very excited. So today, Ben is not a co-host. Ben is an author who we are interviewing. He's in the hot seat, and we'll ask him all the difficult questions. So he's given up his co-host privilege. He doesn't get to tell us to stop or redirect.
The seat is so much more poorly upholstered.
That's right. That's right. So, our last episode, we were talking with Liz Gorinsky, his publisher at Arrow on Books, her new press. And today we're going to ask Ben about the book. And Jed and I have a lot of questions, but maybe we were going to start by asking Ben. So tell us about your elevator pitch. When you came to Liz and pitched this book to her, what did you say it was going to be?
Or any other brief summary.
I think Liz probably learned about the book gradually over a series. I mean, she'd heard me read from it at WisCon, and so that was probably a war of attrition. But I often say it is a far future comedy of manners and social unrest. That's like a mini elevator pitch. It's sort of, and I say that partly because it's hard to distill it down to a few sentences. So it is a coming of age story. It is in a very different world. I spun all the dials. It's a laboratory in which I get to think about I get to spin the dials on what is human being. So, genders work differently, bodies work differently, class works differently. Birth order is a huge marker of social status. It's just as much different as I could think of. And it's, to kind of, part of the impulse is to play around with anthropological science fiction and a lot of stuff that I love, like Le Guin does and Delaney does, and so on, where you're just what could societies look like? Everything we've ever seen so far on Earth has just scratched the surface of all the ways that human societies could be. So there's partly that impulse, and there's also partly an impulse to talk about social change and moral agency and unrest and societies and so on. So it's a troubled utopia / dystopia, heterotopia in the tradition of The Dispossessed, which is an ambiguous utopia, and Turbulent Triton, which is a something or other heterotopia. Anyway, but it's in the tradition of thinking about societies, and I often like to play the game of coming up with the best way that I can imagine humans could live, and then figure out everything that's wrong with it and would make you miserable if you were there.
Nice.
So I don't know if that was an elevator pitch.
I'm not sure it's what we'd call a selling document, but
give more concrete details. But I don't know. Well, anyway,
I think we'll get into more about.
Maybe you should give what would your elevator pitch be? What do you think happened?
Well, I didn't prep for this. I'll think about it. But Jed, I think, had a question for you, so maybe we'll go to that.
Well, I wanted to start with not so much a question as a comment. So those who know me know that I am often ambivalent about fiction, works of fiction, that I am often reserved in my judgment. When I read a draft of this years ago at a workshop, I said that even that draft was my favorite book of the year. And it is now better. I will be surprised if this is not my favorite book of this year. I really love this book, so thank you, Ben. I also think that it is in some ways a major work. It's as big a deal on the gender front as Ancillary Justice, which I feel like it's in dialogue with in some ways. I don't know whether that was at all intentional, but multiple bodies, interesting gender stuff, jumping back and forth between multiple bodies, locations. I also want to say one more thing before we get into the questions, which is that it highlights this book highlights a case where author points are really important. And I think you all have mentioned author points before, but the idea of a measure of the reader's trust in the author. In this book, when I didn't entirely understand something, I trusted that Ben knew what he was doing and would carry me along. And I find that comforting. I know that you have thought about all this stuff, that you've put work into it, and I'm just willing to relax into it. Whereas with an author who I trusted less, I would be more reserved, more staid, you might say, holding back in case they aren't there to catch me when I fall. So, Mary Anne, you wanted to start with questions about viewpoint and
Yeah, I think it's funny. I now want to like assign the first chapter of this book to my creative writing students, just to freak them out, honestly, because every semester we spend a week or two talking about point of view, and we talk about switching points of view within a story and what happens if you shift around in time. And we talk a lot about signposting, that you can do almost anything as long as you signpost it sufficiently so that the reader can follow what you're doing, right? And they're often a little freaked out by this. We use Le Guin's Steering the Craft as our text most of the time, and she has a couple chapters on point of view, and in one of them she quotes, she gives us an excerpt from Tolkien, and there's a bit where
with the fox,
right?
We talked about this. First episode, I think.
Did we? Yeah. So like where there's a point of view shift within the paragraph, and I don't know, the students often like don't quite believe you can do it successfully. So it's useful to have that example, right? So here, when I first started reading The Unraveling, and like Jed, I workshopped an earlier version of this with Ben 3 or so years ago, which had a lot of stuff I loved. I think it has coalesced into a coherent novel now in a way that it wasn't quite there yet 3 years ago. Does that seem fair, Ben?
So, I mean,
yeah. So 3 years ago, I would say it was like this whirlwind of like super fun, interesting ideas, but
I honestly think it might have been longer than 3 years ago too. But
yeah,
anyway, go ahead.
Could have been. And then, but if you asked me like what the plot is, I would have been like, well, so now there's a plot, and now there's, now there's a coherent novel structure, which is great. I mean, which is not to say you can't have experimental works that don't do that, but this, I think, has turned into a novel. So, and so I started reading it, and I started reading it as I was going off on my little writing retreat that I was giving myself. And so for the first time in this pre-pandemic life, I had taken myself and my book to like eat outdoors on a patio. And so I got myself some mussels and a glass of wine. And I have to say, I don't recommend that for starting this book because, it sounds so lovely.
Was it the mussels or the wine that were
the mussels were fine, but the wine did not help. Because I do have to read, especially the first chapter. I had to read very slowly to teach myself the language and the logic of the book, right? And then once I got the hang of it, sure. Then I was fine going forward. But that opening chapter, you have multiple characters and who have multiple bodies, and you are switching points of view between them almost seamlessly. I mean, seamlessly in the sense that it's very smooth, not seamlessly in the sense that it is well signposted. As long as you read it slowly, you actually do know at every moment where you are and whose body you're in and what they're doing.
So maybe from context for readers who don't know what you're talking about, we should just say, because I didn't want to give my elevator pitch, I didn't actually say all of the details of how the book works. So fifth, the protagonist has 3 bodies. So people in this world, as a kind of a hack to avoid dying so much, because sometimes things will happen and you lose a body and that's annoying. They have very advanced medical technology. They will replicate their consciousness across multiple bodies, which are sort of copies of the individual person. I mean, they're on a cell-to-cell level. It's the same person, except they can be in 3 places at once. Partly this is a wish fulfillment fantasy about how, like, wouldn't you like to be in 3 places at once? And also it's like has a lot to do with how their society works. And and that, of course, it was also it was a really interesting writing thing to approach, right? Because I really wanted, and whenever you break the rules of how we understand the world, the reader's mind, is looking to snap back into the way that things usually are. And so I had a lot of line edit back and forth with Liz, where she would try to simplify something, and I would be like, but we can't say, Fifth's body did this, because it's not, you don't say my hand did this. It's just always Fifth doing the thing, just maybe with this body, maybe with that body. And so like there's a sort of a tightrope there of but anyway. So yes, you were saying. I just wanted to say has 3
Ha.
Oh.
Fifth He has.
It's funny because the mistake of when we mistake and call Fifth by an Earth gender, Liz and I make opposite mistakes. Liz tends to gender Fifth one way and I the other. Anyway, Z has 3 bodies.
He has 3 bodies. Okay, yes. So that's like as a base premise, Z and almost basically everyone else we meet has multiple bodies, and it can be tricky to manage multiple bodies, and it seems to be sort of like some sort of sense of maturity to be able to manage a lot of bodies at once. Like it's very impressive when you can manage 9 or 50 or whatever. And Fifth, our protagonist, has kind of established up front that it's worrying that Fifth had trouble managing 3 bodies, right? So that's a element of character. And then the other big aspect that hits the reader right away is gender. And so maybe Jed can take over there talking about. I guess before we do that, I'll just say my question about the multiple bodies and the multiple points of view is, from a writerly viewpoint, did you have a concern about losing your readers, maybe before we get to the gender stuff?
I mean, certainly it was something that I labored at a lot, but it was also, I don't know, did I have a concern? It was more like a thrilling experience to write. You know what I mean? It was more like it was just so much fun and and a sort of a, like, can I pull this off kind of fun.
It made me think about Faulkner, right, in The Sound and the Fury, which has 4 different points of view that are, and the first one is someone that we encounter is someone who's mentally disabled. You're getting the story through his viewpoint. It's very confusing initially when you open that book. And Faulkner, I think I heard that he originally wanted it printed in 4 colors to make it easier for the reader to follow whose voice it was. And the publisher said that was too expensive and didn't do it. And I love that book. It's probably one of my 10 favorite books. And but it was a challenge starting it. Like if I was reading it for a class, and I'm not sure I would have gotten through it on my own. So I do think that's I don't know, I guess I want to encourage listeners, if you start this book and you're finding it very confusing, like, stick with it. It's good. Like so my advisor in grad school at one point said, you're making the reader work very hard, because I had this complex time structure set up. And she said, anytime you make the reader work hard, there has to be a sufficient payoff to justify that work. And I would say in this book, you absolutely get the payoff. The need for the multiple body perspective is evident all the way through, and it lets Ben do things that I don't think he could have done otherwise. So yeah, that's I am defending the multiple bodies. If anyone comes after you for it, if you see mean reviews saying there's too many bodies, just tag me in, and I will go yell at them.
There's at least one review on Goodreads where somebody might throw by the bodies, and I have every sympathy, because that. But I also, most of the feedback I got, when you say, was I worried about it, I also got a lot of. That wasn't the thing that threw people. That didn't tend to be the thing that threw people in revision. So I got like a lot of reassuring feedback along the way, including people who aren't particularly science fiction readers. So I think,
Maybe I was.
And I'll say one last thing, and then I'll pass it to Jed, which is that I don't think it's actually that different in effect from what I do when I jump around in time with my characters. So, like, I'll be telling the story from the present day, but then there's a flashback to the past, or a flashback to the future. And in some sense, it ends up being represented the same way, right? Like, here's the same person, but they are in a different body in a different time, and so on. So if you're comfortable with that, I don't think this is such a stretch.
Yeah, and I love that kind of. That makes me think of like Love and Rockets, where they will, like the comic book Love and Rockets, where they will very quickly, just have a page, and it's like, now Maggie and Hopi are 6, and it's like, you just know, like, there's not a lot of signposting, there's not a lot of like, and now we flash back to 1979. Like, it's sort of seamlessly blended in, and it gives this feeling of, there's this feeling of intimacy in that. So.
Well, and I think that people, readers and audiences, get used to these sorts of things over time and need less signposting. And I think Ancillary Justice helped with that, because of the jumping back and forth between bodies, so that you get what's going on in different places. And that didn't help for people who haven't read it, but I think that it helped lay some groundwork for people to experience your multi-bodied characters. I do want to note that, as far as I can tell, in the first chapter, it is entirely from Fifth's point of view. We do get other viewpoints later, but it does jump
Almost
between
the whole book
bodies.
is from Fifth's point of view. There's interstitial found texts from the world.
Yeah.
But most of I literally think there's like a section where I sneak away from Fifth's point of view, but we are generally always in Fifth's point of view.
Yeah.
Other than the sort of found texts that are like inserts of, things that have been that are like things you would find in that planet. And Thabe's letter.
Very Le Guin-y.
Yeah.
I think that helps too, that we don't mostly have to jump into other people's heads.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to insert the phrase reading protocols. I think that Mary Anne said that something about sort of learning how to read this book. I think that in some ways it helps teach the reader how to read it. And I think that can be a hard thing to do and a really useful thing for science fiction in particular.
Yeah.
So then gender.
Okay, gender. So we should start by talking about what the two genders in this world are. There are two specifically, but they are not the genders that they are not the traditional binary genders that we have here on Earth. And sorry,
I'm sorry, I just said for humans, because like other species have lots of.
Yes, fair point. Yes, well, and humans have more than two as well, but
sure,
traditionally. And I do think that it's worth noting, I think this is quite clear in the current novel, but just to be clear, these are humans in the far future. They are not some sort of aliens. But the two genders are called Stade and Vale. And I think these are, by the way, better names than you had for them in the past. The Stades are calm and generally quiet, and the Vales are active and emotional. And these genders don't map.
I just
neatly.
Realized how funny it is that we are doing this interview with Jed and Mary Anne, who are you would fit very comfortably into.
Which is to say, for listeners, I am very Stade, Mary Anne is very Vale.
I disagree with that.
I mean, Jed is very Stade. Mary Anne there's a bit of a mix, but certainly by contrast.
By contrast, I suppose. But I will note on Myers-Briggs, which I was going to bring up into all of this, because when you talk about, and astrology and whatever else, right? If you think about the different ways that people have of categorizing ways humans can be, right? I think things like I'm a Leo, or, I'm a, but on Myers-Briggs, I will say they have one of the scales is thinking versus feeling, right? And I think your Vales are very feeling extreme, and your Stades are very thinking extreme. And I come out 50-50 on that.
Fair enough. True.
So do you really, Chad? Say I'm surprised by that. You come out 50-50?
Every time.
I cry a lot at movies, for instance, which is not something that Stades would do.
Or not
at least
in public.
Yes, not gender conforming Stades.
That's right.
So as part of this introduction of the genders, I want to note that I like that the terms are fairly easy to remember which one is which. And I also liked that, so you're using the pronouns Z and V, and I liked that the Z goes with the Stade, the Z and the S, and V goes with Vales, the V and the V. That made it much easier for me to keep track of which characters are which gender. Okay, so
there's a lot of engineering of all that.
And it actually took me a little while to parse that. I'll just say, I think for a while I was thinking of it more like I and you. And so when it would be Z, I would be thinking that was standing in for I and me. And V was you. And it took me quite a while, I think, several chapters in, before I realized that was not what was happening. So
I can see how that could be confusing.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's my first big question. Why call Stade and Vade genders as such?
Stade and Vale.
I didn't say Vale. Stade and Vale.
Well, so I mean, there's a couple of different answers for that. Some intratextual and some extratextual. Okay. So the intratextual answer is because Thave is translating this document for Siob. So the whole thing has a frame tale where this is happening on the planet and somebody is translating it, and Thave is basically like, I'm going to use, I'm going to
interrupt for just a second first to let the readers know that Ben is talking about one character who doesn't appear until halfway through the book, and another character who doesn't appear in the book at all. So
yes,
there is a frame, but it is not at all obvious that there's a frame until much later.
There's a very subtle frame tale, but it's sort of in an appendix. It's kind of the kind of a grace note. But the intertextual answer is we're thinking of them as genders because the book is being translated for us, and that's the closest.
Great.
And that's the closest thing we would. But there's a bit in where they say, well, I have translated their, I don't know. At some point, Thave gives the technical term. I have translated their social moiety into these genders. The other answer is the deeper answer is because I think that we live in a world with a gender binary, and what we do is we take in the world that I grew up in. I mean, it's changing, but the world that I grew up in, the standard practice of my culture was to, when babies were born, make note of particular physical details that were considered very salient by my culture, and then classify them into these two different categories, these two distinct categories, and then these relatively malleable and minor physical details. I mean, relevant, but sort of biological. It's like, I don't know. It's like, and then take this physical detail and erect upon it this enormous infrastructure of what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and what maybe you could get away with, but it'd be kind of embarrassing, and what everyone would expect of you, or maybe expect you to not do, or like
what all your traits should be.
Like this enormous catalog, not a simple like this is this way and this is one way, but even a more complex thing where it's like, well, this is this way except there's this exception, but then there's this writer and the like this vast infrastructure that we build on top of this minor difference. And so I was, and I want this to be, I was like, well, this is far in the future, they would do something else. And there's a way in which I feel like, what is a gender? So a gender is a classification like this where you've sort of sorted everybody, and you've decided that this is you were talking about sort of Myers-Briggs and horoscopes and something. There's a saying in linguistics that a language, the definition of a language is it's a dialect with an army. What there really are in the world is dialects, and then some of them gain enough political power that they become, the official thing that everything has to be printed in and taught in schools. And it's like that. Gender is like a personality quiz result that everyone decided to make an army like enforce or something. Maybe that's not, but they're extrapolating from certain physical details. So my idea about stades and veils is that it's the APGAR test. When I had my kids, when they come out, they give them this little APGAR test to see like how active they are as baby. When if they're still blue, or if they're wiggling a lot, or they get a score. And it was basically like, that's a pretty salient detail when they come out. You're very interested when a baby comes out, like how active are they? Are they sort of sleepy, or are they and you could take that same detail and erect this whole edifice of like expectations of what they would grow up to become, and who they should be in the world, and who they should be with, and what they should do on that minor detail. So that was the genesis.
I have a question, Ben, and this is where I feel like I'm going to expose my ignorance about trans issues. So I'm going to just say up front that I have not yet read Whipping Girl, which is like on my list of like, things I need to learn to be better educated in the world.
Yeah.
But it seems like you are potentially running into some difficulty here in terms of, gender politics in our world, and a sense of, things that are very much based in, I don't know.
I revised this book after reading Whipping Girl, let me say. And the interesting thing is that I think there's 2 points to be made. One is that, which is the one I was first interested in, is that isn't it weird that we are born into the world, we have people make a decision about our gender, and then on top of that there is all this stuff that we are expected to play with, one kind of toy, and I don't know, like all this stuff we're expected to do. This is weird, and it's very culturally dependent, right? That's one insight, which is sort of like, wow, there's all this weird roles that we get shoved. But there's another equally important insight, which is what I took from Whipping Girl, which is that, and it isn't, while it, to claim that it is culture all the way down is an erasure of something crucial, right? Like that there's no, that to, it can easily slip into saying that there's no there, right?
Yeah.
And that is, that doesn't fit with our experience of the world. Our experience of the world is that, in fact, there are people who fight enormously hard with their life's blood because they have an internal perception of gender which differs from the, it clearly it's not just something you can easily slap on someone and say, be this, and they're like, okay, that's fine. In fact, the entire story of gender is all of this policing of people into these roles which they struggle against. Like if we didn't struggle against the gender roles, we were even cis people, but like how much more so for trans people, that so people have an unerring ineluctable sense of their gender. And what's interesting in this world in which so there was two things I felt like I had to do after I read Weapon Girl. One of which was, there's two issues here. One is somatic. One is like dysphoria is real. In this world, they might think that in this world, they don't particularly care about your genitals any more than they do about the length of they're not particularly worked up with them any more than they are about, the length of your earlobes or whether you have a deviated septum or whether your belly button's an innie or an outie. You know what I mean? It's a biological detail. Experts would know about it. And, certainly there's Shreya, one of the characters, is a genital designer, so they're very interested in genitals and they refashion new genitals all the time and whatever. But like, there's a scene where Shreya, there's like this one line in there where Shreya, where Fifth is like, oh, so you made their genitals all match, and Shreya's like, no, you can't just give anybody any genitals. Oh my God, you'll make them miserable. Like, they're not hats, which is a sort of a funny line, but I kind of wanted to say, no, there's a real fundamental, profound relationship between the body and the self, and it's not all hand waving and culture and like Lego. You can't just mix and match people. Like, they have a ineluctable physicality, and what's in their self-perception and their nature may or may not match like their bodies and or their social roles. And the other thing is, there's a lot of things that are both culturally mediated and also deeply and ineluctably physical. I think, whether you can't just make somebody like chocolate because your culture thinks they ought to like chocolate. You can't just make somebody, you know what I mean? Like, there's not any particular fact of gender which is acultural, but there's also not this kind of cultural overdetermination where there's no there biologically. Like, both things are at every level.
But can I think I can give a more coherent question now.
Okay.
So you talk about gender being something that people have a sort of ineluctable sense of, and I would kind of say, I'm really going to frame all this in my experience, that is true to a lesser or greater degree, right? Some people feel very strongly connected to gender, and some less so.
Yeah.
And I'll also add the framing of, when I had my first kid, my partner bought this book. I think it's called Pink Brain, Blue Brain. And it was sort of a survey of all of the science around gender in babies, right? And children. And the overall arching result was that she found that there were some biologically based differences between male and female that got dramatically, not aggravated, but like I'm losing the word, but
accentuated, like it's a positive feedback loop,
right? By culture, right? So, and this is a thing humans do, and I think we do it with other things as well, right? Where we see some small physical difference between two groups, and then we expand on it, and we
well, and also some small transient labile difference. What happens is, if in first grade, if you can read slightly better, whether or not that has any, we happen to know that how well you read in first grade doesn't actually correlate that well in the absence of your school system tracking you to how well you'll read 3 years later. Like, it's kind of random at what rate, but we tend to live in a world that seizes upon that and then tracks you into a whole different thing. And like, your destiny is different based on some feature that's not only small, but also probably not that durable. You know what I mean? Or even really.
Yes. So kind of with all of that as framing, and sort of saying that for myself, I generally think of myself as cisgender female, but I'm also not that attached to it, in the sense of I feel like most of my femaleness is imposed on me by the world, right? In terms of my safety walking down the street and gender dynamics in a marriage and whatever else. And if I were living alone in the woods, I'm not sure how connected I would feel to female as anything. But I wonder, and so I guess with all of that in mind, I wondered, I don't know, I guess I was reading this, I felt a little bit uneasy because you could make an argument that this book erases male and female as categories, right? And what does that mean for, say, a trans reader reading the book who says, you know, here's this thing that I think is really fundamental to my experience of being human, that in this far future, it's just gone. It doesn't seem to exist anymore, right? So is that a concern for you, or do you think it's not relevant?
Well, it's not that I don't think it's relevant. I think that's a really profound point. Here's what I would say. Well, first, let me roll back to like the you in the woods. So like I feel like I've had a journey about that in interaction with trans people and thinking about this, where I out like 10 years ago would have probably said like, well, you know, I mean, I'm assigned male, but it's no big deal. I don't feel like particularly attached to maleness. Most of maleness irritates me, whatever. I am much more aware now what a hallmark of cis privilege that is, right? Like, it's like, well, of course I don't care. I also don't like, I mean, it's easy for white people to be like, race is no big deal. Like, doesn't bother me. Like, it's, I have had the good luck to have ended up with society assigning me in a way that like I'm fine with, and that feels like not caring, but I don't know.
And
right?
and I guess I'll also say, you know, I had cancer. I went through menopause as a result, and also it was breast cancer. So I've, you know, had surgery on my breasts and have thought about, you know, things like a double mastectomy. And so there's, I think for me, my experience of being female is very time encoded, right? Like the way I was before cancer, it was much more relevant than now, right? That, you know, now that, you know, childbearing and so on is out of the picture. And I don't know if men experience aging in that same way, right? You know, there's a reason why we have like this image of the maiden, the mother, and the crone, and we don't have an equivalent, right, for men.
True, but I would also say that I think that for a lot of people, their genderedness is not closely tied to things like being able to bear children or body shape.
For some people, but I think for some people it really, really is, right? I mean, there's a reason why, you know, why health insurance got pressured to pay for, you know, breast reconstruction as part of cancer treatment, because it was seen as being fundamental to, I think, to biological, to gender identity, right? Like women didn't feel like women anymore when they didn't have breasts, some women, right? And so that.
Sure. I mean, yeah. So on the one hand, it isn't people's experience of gender is not determined by their bodies, but it's affected by their bodies, right? So people, and you know, essentially it's like a lot, I mean, essentially what many cis women will experience if they have to have a mastectomy is in some ways akin to gender dysphoria that trans people experience by having, you know what I mean? It's like, well, this is the wrong body now. And that actually exposes that cis people who otherwise might have been like, yeah, I don't care, suddenly maybe notice that they have like a particular attachment to a particular way of being gendered in the world, which trans people are forced to notice constantly, and cis people mostly have the privilege of ignoring. I mean, anyway.
Yeah.
In answer to your question about whether like is this something that worries me, I don't know. I'm fascinated by it. Like I certainly, like, I don't know. The game here, and it's maybe a risky game, is to take the reader to this world in which to take seriously the notion of this is 500,000 years in the future. Most of the things that we treasure about the world, that we treasure about our understanding of the self, that we are going to be different. And the notion of maleness and femaleness was different in the past, you know, was profoundly different in, you know, 1,000 years ago. And that's only 1,000 years ago. This is 500 times that, right? And I want it to feel like the characters in the book are experiencing their embodiedness in the world and chafing against it, and that social structures are imposing it upon them. And I want all that to feel familiar and yet estranged, right? It's all different. And I think there are enough traces in there are there are, I won't say enough, there are, I mean to leave there be the thread that we know that the things that we experience as maleness and femaleness are not completely, it's not like they were banished as if they never were. It's not that they were a fever dream, but it's also like the cultural constellation is so dramatically different that that we find ourselves in a different place. So I don't know. It's a really good question. I mean, there's a lot of trans people, and they'll all have different reactions to the book. And the ones who read it, the critiques I got, they were pretty excited about this take on gender. But that does not say that that will be everyone's experience. So, yeah, that is, I can completely see somebody. I mean, I can totally see somebody being like, this removes this thing that you know what I mean? Like, in a way, it's like, well, this thing that people have to fight for is just not here.
Yeah,
And that can be,
so the concern is like, when we have, I'm glad you had trans readers look at this. I mean, I would have expected you to, but it's still reassuring to me. Because, one of the big criticisms around race in science fiction is this kind of like future in which, we're post-racial. There are no,
It's actually, I mean, you bring that up. It's interesting. That's something I am in a way more concerned about, is that the book does not have race, which in a way is because
too many complicated things to deal with.
Well, no. I mean, maybe, but it's also like, I mean, partly perhaps, but also it's like, race is really again, it's us fixating on some particular biological details and making those into a thing. I mean, it's not only that, it is also, so it's that, and then it's the lived experience that people have had that has allowed them to create aspects of their cultures and their identities, which have roots in that, right? So part of what the book does about this is that Thave, who shows up in the middle of the book, as you mentioned, and is sort of a very long-lived person who has seen many of these civilizations rise and fall, is concerned about how homogenous this world is. Essentially, is like, you guys are running up on the border of how homogenous a world this big can be.
Okay, wait, I'm gonna ask you to hold that thought, because I want to dive into that after the intermission, but we want to finish up gender first. So let's stay on gender for a little bit.
We'll stay on gender.
Well, let's finish up gender. Okay, so I have a couple of last questions about gender and a thought or two. You've sort of been getting toward this, but why the choice to make a society, to focus on this society being strongly gender conformist, rather than, for instance, a society in which anybody can be any gender?
I mean, that's the thing I was interested in exploring. The things I was interested in illuminating. And sometimes I've seen, like, sometimes there's been some like ad copy or brief reviews where people are like, it's a world beyond gender. I'm like, no, it's not a world beyond gender. It's not, we're over gender. Because I feel like that's a very, I mean, not that I don't want to read such books, because I totally do. I totally want to read gender utopias in which, like, whatever, gender is a mode of play. Like, I love the role-playing game, Dream Apart's sister game, Dream Askew, is like, the genders are all like Raven, and you know what I mean? Like, but this, I mean, anytime you talk about oppression, there's different ways that works of art can engage with it. You can make the oppression go away and try to imagine what the world would be like in a utopian mode with this oppression gone, or you can try to
aspirational
engage with it, and those are different, right? Like, so this is not aspirational. The society is not aspirational. If anything, I mean, I don't want to reduce it to just one thing, because I spent a decade with this book, so there's like a lot of things that it ended up doing, but a thing that I was very interested in was taking all of these verities that we, even if we are consciously critical of them, that we just sort of have absorbed, that we, all these aesthetics about what makes sense for men to do and what makes sense for women to do, and, that they're, and our difficulty of putting people who aren't men or women in any of those, of mapping those things onto them, and not just this sort of official things, but just sort of like modes of everyday interaction, like ways you talk to kids or ways that you ask somebody out on a date or whatever, like that, all those things. We live in this world, we can't even see how gendered everything is, that we perceive everything through this lens. And so what I wanted to do is take a society that had a similar, enforced gender binary with strict roles, but have them be ones that we don't believe in, but they believe in. Because that creates this gap in which we could sort of see how both absurd and menacing and poignant and that it's on some level, like I'm hoping that you sink into this world enough that you start absorbing like how Stades should act and how Vale should act, and become a little uncomfortable when Stades act in Valish ways and Vale's act in other ways, and then snap back and go, wait, this is fucking absurd. There's no such thing. Like this, what? Like you're gonna shame people because they're not corresponding to this, really? But and then that will bleed over into your experience of our world, in which we have a set of very weird filters that we've received.
I don't want to talk too much about it because it's relatively late in the book, but there's some really lovely gender transgression in this. Okay, so then I have one.
I will say one other thing. I don't know if you're going to get to this, but the other thing is that I did struggle with, and that also was another thing that I had to like. How are trans and non-binary people going to react to this? Is the pronouns?
Yeah,
I don't know if you were going to ask about that.
Go ahead.
I love pronouns, so
I do, but I wasn't going to ask about it. Go ahead.
That was just one of the hard decisions, because this book oddly has already come out in German. So 2 years, there's a rather different 2018 German language version of the book. And in that version, I don't use neopronouns. I use er and sie, the German pronouns. Although, to be fair, they're also the German pronouns for like forks and spoons. So it's somewhat of a different thing, because many languages gender everything, not just humans. So the genders don't feel as much like human genders. Anyway, so in English, if you say something's he, you're really saying it's a boy. Right. Whereas in German, you might just be saying it's a table. But Liz, my editor, is the one. I think maybe we talked about this. It was a big decision, which was Liz's idea, really, or she pushed me in that direction of actually using neopronouns. And one of the things I was quite concerned with is, are these things that are used by real people today, and am I appropriating them? So I, tried to do a certain amount of due diligence about that. But again, everybody, you can't talk to everybody, and I don't know how everyone will feel about my having used their thing. But what made me ultimately feel better about it, well, first of all, was the reaction of non-binary people being like, no, that's dope. And second of all, was the feeling that a decision I made, this is the kind of behind the curtain thing that only I care about, and it's not on the page, but my decision that I am not just using these things, but that I am extrapolating. Like there is some way in which perhaps these terms came into vogue. Perhaps these aren't like I'm just porting them into my world. Maybe this is science fiction. So these are descendants of humanity. So like maybe these neopronouns that are now, becoming a thing became more of a thing and then lasted and then were forgotten and reinvented and resurfaced and whatever. And so we're actually using, something that it's actually those things existing in the future, not just being inserted. Anyway.
Okay, so I have one last comment about the gender stuff, which will lead into one last question from me about the gender. I found it unfortunately easy for me to fall into assigning a particular male or female modern binary gender to a particular Stade versus Vale gender within your book, and especially given that you said that you and Liz tended to slip in the opposite directions, I'm not going to say which way I did, but I had to keep consciously reminding myself to apply both, and to remind myself that they're really neither. This is a different axis, and I thought that was interesting, in partly because it was sort of the opposite of what happened to me with ancillary justice, where the lack of gender kind of short-circuited my brain and left me mostly just not trying to apply genders to characters. And I thought that both of those sort of acting in different directions are really fascinating effects. So my question related to this for you is if you could say a little about, I know that there was a time when you applied the regender tool to change the pronouns and throughout the book, and I wondered if you could say a little about that.
I don't know if I actually.
Ben, before you do that, my last gender comment was also about this, so you can just factor this in. I had a similar experience with ancillary justice to Jed's, where the lack of gender, once it colonized my brain, I then stopped trying to assign gender anymore, I'd never had a book do that before. Like I'd never, so it was so groundbreaking and fascinating that it really changed the way I thought. I actually didn't. so having read an earlier version of this and this, I'll say the earlier version, I did keep assigning he and she to Stayed Vale or Vale Stayed or whatever at the time. And I didn't with this one, actually.
Nice.
So I think, maybe a little bit in the first chapter or so, but it got disrupted really quickly. And yeah, after that, I think he and she mostly kind of disappeared from the book. I think the one time where I'm trying to see if this constitutes a spoiler. I think I can talk about it without it being a spoiler. The one time where it threatened to come back was in a sex scene. And, but then the way the scene was written, I think it actively worked against letting me settle into one of them being male and one being female.
Yeah.
So, which I was pleased by. I was like, good job, Ben. So, so that's my comment. For me, it really did. The book does establish new genders, and I kind of set male and female aside for the reading experience.
Nice.
So.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, I think both of those ways of reading it are perfectly legitimate. I think that, obviously I'm delighted if, in fact, you manage to just enter into the world of the book and you don't have male and female in your head. But I also think that, the earlier versions did use he and she. And it's, as you said, Jed, I didn't actually use regender. I've used regender for other things. It's a cool website. But I actually am writing this in Scrivener, and I made a Scrivener compile script, which would compile it to two different versions, a he, she. I wrote with my own internal pronouns for the text, but at the time I was like, this is too much to ask anyone to swallow, to use these complicated made-up pronouns. So what I will eventually have to publish this in he and she because the market will insist. But that was sort of how I felt 5 years ago. But I was like, well, but I will, to keep myself honest, I will not decide until the last minute if it's going to be he and she or she and he. And so I will compile, whenever I save the document, 2 PDFs, one in which fifth is he and Tria is she, and one in fifth is she and Tria is he, and so on. Vales and Stades have assigned the different set of genders. And what was fascinating was how profoundly different it read, even though it was the same world with the same actual genders, with the same in-world expectations. Merely the English pronoun colored the text enormously, which I shouldn't have been surprised by, but I was surprised by the extent of it. And I realized I had been somewhat naive in thinking like, oh well, we'll just tell you that these are different genders, not our genders, and you'll just because the brain wants to, we are. But I think in some ways that having to struggle against that is also an interesting experience because you realize how difficult it is, how difficult it is not to look through our filters. So I don't know. I feel like whether you can, like Mary Anne did, just easily put on the new glasses of the book, or whether you find yourself constantly struggling, between that lens and the old lens. Both is sort of a way of, I think both are interesting because it shows how deeply we are connected to that.
I think one of my big sadnesses with this is I'm so sorry that Le Guin can't read this.
Yeah.
Right? Because, sorry, not to break your heart. I'm sorry. But I'm just,
I'm just like amazed at the notion that she would, but like that's
no, but it feels to me like a direct inheritor of the things that she raised in Left Hand of Darkness in particular regarding gender. And I think we probably talked about this in the interview with Liz, but the essay she wrote about first defending her use of the he pronoun and then the follow-up revision essay where she says, no, I was wrong, right? All of this feels like it's very much in conversation with that. Yeah. And so I can sort of trace, you could just do a course with that book, those essays, Ancillary Justice, and then the Unraveling, and that would be
Stars in my pocket like grains of sand.
Sure,
in which Delaney's book, in which everybody is she unless you happen to be in that moment sexually attracted to them, in which case they're he.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's right. I read that so long ago. I'd forgotten that. And there are others, Varley and so on. Like you could put some more, but anyway. Okay. So we're going to take an intermission, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about other aspects of the book.
Because there are many other awesome pieces of the aspects of the book, not just gender.
Not just gender and points of view. Yes.
And multiple bodies.
Yes. So, okay. Taking a break. Back soon.
Okay. Enough about the Unraveling, though. Let's talk about Mary Anne's book. Vegan Serendib is a cookbook, the sequel to the wonderful Feast of Serendib, except now vegan, and it is full of amazing recipes like garlic ginger tofu, dried hibiscus boreal, pumpkin curry, green tomato chutney with apples, rose hibiscus salad, tamarind rice with black lentils, jaggery rice pudding on banana leaves. Incredibly yummy. I have to tell you, having been to Mary Anne's house a lot, that her cooking is delicious, and her cookbooks are clear and beautiful, and they are also imbued with her personality, and they are stealth memoirs. There are little meditations on identity, family, diaspora, immigration, domesticity. All that stuff is slipped in between the pages intimately. And also really delicious food, and also royal feast for 200 people. Mary Anne will tell you how to cook vegan food for 200 people. You should go to Kickstarter and search on Vegan Serendib or Mary Anne Mohenraj and back the heck out of it. Thanks.
So we're back. We're talking with Benjamin Rosenbaum, author of The Unraveling and the co-host of this podcast, but we're not going to let him co-host. And Jed Hartman and I are interviewing him about the book, and we have just finished reading it, and we have gazillion questions. So I wanted to talk a little about sort of a fundamental societal structure you have set up here. About midway through the book, I don't think this is a spoiler, really. You have this alien who is extremely long-lived, and when I say that, I think he's like 500,000 years old at that point, right? Or that so they
Z is like 500,000 years old.
Sorry, Z is like 500,000 years old. Tave, and Tave has seen civilizations rise and fall, and there's a conversation that Tave has with the protagonist Fifth, who is an adolescent at that point, very much an adolescent by his society standards, or a child by his society standards. Oh my gosh, Zer society standards, yes. So by Zer society standards. And it really reminded me, and I wanted to ask whether you'd read these books, but Enchantress from the Stars by Sylvia Louise Engdahl, and the follow-up, I think it's called The Far Side of Evil. So they're wonderful.
I read them when I was like 10, but not since then.
Brilliant young adult novels that grapple with a similar question to what Tave is grappling with, which is seeing two main modes for civilizations, and kind of a one in which they're fairly static and in a sort of homeostatic state that is not very generative, exciting. I don't know. And one in which they are kind of maybe always like racing towards destruction, but in exciting ways that open up lots of possibilities. And those books are about, should you intervene to save people? So it's a little bit more of a prime directive-y kind of question, how it's framed there. Here, it made me think about the 70s feminist science fiction, second wave science fiction of people like Sherry Tepper and Susie McKee Charnas and so on, who often wrote these kind of gender essentialist novels where women were a certain way. I'm thinking of like Gate to Women's Country, where the women are peaceful and civilized and live inside a walled city, and I'm telling for people who haven't read the book, and the men are exiled to the outside, and where they fight and they compete for status and they do male things, right? And this way they're not destructive of civilization, right? That's it was a premise of a lot of fiction around that era.
Le Guin has a version of that in The Matter of Segre, but it's somewhat more nuanced.
Yeah.
Complicated version.
So I think in a lot of ways we have, changed our sense of all of this. We no longer necessarily think testosterone is the great evil in the world. We have seen, women leaders of countries who are warmongery and just as destructive as men can be.
Although Sherry Tepper is, of course, writing after Golda Meir and
so
Elizabeth I. But okay, sure.
But
yes, of course.
Well, but I think I don't know. I feel like the cultural conversation has shifted. But my question for you here is: do you feel like you've set it up this way? Is this just a thought experiment to you? Do you feel like it's accurate in some ways. I guess I was a little resistant to it because where I've seen this set up, it has been in gendered terms. It's been like sort of a kind of a sexist argument about, oh, a women's society would be safe and boring, and it's men who bring the excitement and the progress of civilization, and sure, that has to be violent sometimes, but that's the only way that humanity will advance. And I'm guessing that was not what you were going for, but
well, I think it's funny that you are, when you slip up during this podcast, gendering states one way, but your theory genders them the other way.
Yeah.
Anyway, but to respond, I think that, I feel like this is one of those things where it's like, you never know what chords you're tugging on, and it's easy to be reminiscent of things. I think that when Thave is talking about this, there are two schools of thought. And Thave doesn't say your world is boring. Fifth obviously doesn't find Zir world boring, right? Like, it's not like, and also Fifth's world is a world that's, as you can see in the back matter, undergone dramatic changes. Like, the whole three body thing is relatively new. The giant excavations in the planet turning into a garden on top and mega cities below is relatively, like, it's hardly a static society, right? It's actually not static that Thave is talking about, but homogeneous. And I don't know that Thave is right. And Thave isn't saying these are the way that societies are. Thave is speaking as a member of a weird professional class of long-lived beings who've decided that the prime directive could go to hell, and they are going to meddle in these societies. However, Pache, Star Trek, they find that a lot harder than, you don't just show up with magic technology and make everything the way you want. It's actually quite a difficult job and mostly unintended consequences.
You have this metaphor of the sort of gardener, right, as being a mode. And speaking as someone who spent all day yesterday working in my garden and will spend the rest of today doing so, like, that seems very apt to me, right? Like, I do one thing with a certain intent, and then, the burdock shows up, and like, all of my efforts are gone to naught because there's this new thing that I'm dealing with, right? So,
Thave is not a very big part of the book, page count wise, but this is sort of a thing I'm interested in, and that is a sort of a central scene in which, just for a minute, you zoom out to see this from Thave's perspective. So you've been seeing the whole book, this teenager's very urgent, immediate experience of the world, very flustered, very trying to figure out the world of the rules of the worlds he lives in, and you just get this one conversation where it zooms out to like this entire scale of 500,000 years, and you see this in the context of all this stuff.
And by the way, I loved that.
Me too. I love. I want more Thave. So you better write some follow up Thave stories. There are some
more
already.
Thave.
I know, but
Thave actually appears in an Asimov story that came out last year, Bereft, I Come to a Nameless World, which takes place in the world of the Unraveling and is about Thave and Siob talking. Anyway.
Nice. We should link to that.
But yeah.
This book, mostly about Fifth and Shriya and Dobrok and just a little bit of Thave in there. Anyway, I think Thave is not saying these are the ways societies are. Thave is saying these are the two hacks we've figured out to manage them, like the two directions we can push them in. And, Thave works very hard to keep this society from contacting other societies, because once they start overlapping, it becomes, ripple effects, and it becomes even harder to manage. Like, who the hell knows what's going to happen? So this disinclination to be interested in the rest of the universe and this sort of cultural homogeneity are actually things that Thave both has had a part in fostering and also worries about. And it's sort of, and I don't think it's quite the Sherry S. Tepper, like, oh, this is a deracinated society where no one has any oomph because they don't go to war, although that's what Panaximandra thinks. Panaximandra's account is straight out of a gender essentialist 70s novel, but the book does not think Panaximandra's right either. But I think Thave is talking about an over-optimized system, talking about having balanced everything so carefully that if anything goes wrong, a lot can go wrong. And
I don't. I don't mean to say that where you ended up is what I was concerned about. It was it weirdly threw me for a little while.
I mean, well, I think it's a good point. And when you say it, I am like, well, that immediately, of course, makes me want to write some a next installment in which I'm like, but surely there's more than these two options, right? I mean, like, so yeah. I mean, that yes, certainly that may not be the end of the story.
And I do love, and maybe I can transition here to this, the way that Thave is struggling with this, controlled homeostasis, safe, relatively safe system, as opposed to a less controlled, wild system. To me, that I hope deliberately, I think deliberately echoes everything Fift is going throughout the book in terms of their parents. Sorry, I'm gonna say they, because
they is best when we can't remember.
So their parents attempt to control them, and for those who haven't read yet, it's very relevant that Fift is, for much of the book, is an only child with a large parental cohort. And so
large for our world, actually small by their standards, but yeah.
Right. So how many are there in the cohort?
It's 9 parents, right?
Nine
Which
parents.
is just skirting the minimum of like what you can get away with.
And of course, each parent has multiple bodies.
And each parent has multiple bodies. So lots of bodies, but 9 parents. And I think, I think one thing you hear a lot with parenting is kind of, it's best if you're not outnumbered by the kids, right? Like there's because, when you have, like, if you have 2 parents and 2 kids, you can play one-on-one, and if you've got 3 kids, then you're in zone defense mode, which is much harder, right? So
what I hear is it gets easier after 5. Like I've heard that the inflection point is 5. Like after 5, it's like you clearly by 5 after 5 you must have cracked the puzzle of having kids take care of each other. So then I think that assumes more of a middle manager. And there's like a whole bunch of subtrees under.
But that assumes that you're, I think, have some older and some younger, right? And that the older ones get, to some extent, pushed into,
like sextuplets would be a whole different.
They get pushed into somewhat parental roles, is what happens, right? And that my mom is the oldest of 9, so I think she parented a lot of her younger sibs, right? So which is again actually a thing in your book, the elder younger sib supplanting thing. So anyway, I'll throw all that out there as framework, and maybe Jed can pick up. I don't know. This was all fascinating to me, right? I mean, I am a parent. I have 2 kids. Ben and I have talked a lot about parenting over the years. It's a subject we both find really fascinating. And so I was thrilled to see that this was so central to your text because, and I think in some sense, Thave is also functioning as a parent to civilizations, right? So
interesting.
Did you not intend that?
Well, the midwives also get called the ordering parents of the world, but it's a little bit of they're a bit arrogating that role in a way, And Thave, I don't know, I think Thave would be circumspect about calling herself the parent, because I feel like Thave, anyway, but
or a meddling auntie. I mean,
more like closer to a meddling auntie. I feel like, just to touch on Thave briefly, one of the things that I wanted to do with Thave's role also is that, the story we expect is that Thave is this sort of like either like the Enterprise arriving and wrestling with the Prime Directive, or this, invading force or godlike whatever, or malevolent. But, Thave's just kind of like, Thave's pretty transparent. Thave just shows up and is like, so I've seen a lot of civilizations. Can I give you some notes? Like, that's that. And I love the idea that Thave's just got an apartment and like, talks to people, and like, there's probably some important, councils and whatever they invite Thave, but like not that much power really. It's just a wealth of experience. Of course, the parenting is really, in some ways, and childing, its complement, are kind of the central drama of the book. I mean, really, there's also a couple of love stories in there, but really, and the whole thing about social change writ large. But really, the main engine of the book is the family, and it's very much a book I am writing as a parent and as a child of parents, and so I think that in some ways there's a lot of, the book operates on 2 levels, because on the one hand it's an extrapolation, like I really want to play the science fictional game of like, what would happen if this were this way, and I've did the math about how many buildings would fit into the thing, and how often they could reproduce, and what would be the social constraint. Like that was we mentioned that in an earlier episode too. Like that's fun. Like you discover it, not because I'm going to get it right, because it's 500,000 in the future. Obviously, there's no getting it right, but just because it is revelatory. You find out stuff. But at the same time as playing that game, there's also another game the book is playing, which is that it's a satirical, it's a take on modern life too, right? Because that's what science fiction does. And so the whole, like, there's a lot of like reductio ad absurdum of like, at the moment, comparing my childhood to my kids' childhood and the whole like helicopter parenting thing, and how everybody's like, oh, Stranger Things, remember when they could just bike all day and their parents don't wonder where they are, and because there's only one phone in the house and it's like attached to the wall, like that. That was my childhood, right? And now there's this enormous pressure where parents are neglectful if they don't constantly know everything about what their children are doing, and they should worry about who their kids are texting and what they're, and the industry of like also like parenting magazines marketed at middle class parents that are all like, and other parents, but like, the ones with disposable income in particular are they're similar to the beauty industry, the way it makes, women insecure about how they look and then has a million things to sell them to fix that. You see the same phenomenon with parenting, and that's sort of like anxiety of like, are you parenting right, is like a huge part of the social structure of this world, and leads to these things where you have like 9 parents is clearly not enough. Like, you're not giving your child enough attention with only 9 parents per child. That is substandard parenting. Anyway, so like a lot of that is sort of a satirical take on, and also the stuff about panoptic surveillance, and you're always on YouTube all the time, and your 15 minutes of fame is like a thing. They study a class on like what will happen when you blow up to be instant famous. A lot of that is sort of, so on the one hand, it's as honestly as I can make it 500,000 years in the future, and on the other hand, it's very much like a satire of things that I wrestle with now. Also, the idea that it's a static, homogenous society in which there's very little violence but an enormous amount of social control is 100% Switzerland too, right? Like, it's 100% like my experience as an immigrant in this weird utopia where, this weird sort of Omelas-like utopia in which, at what price do we, is everything?
Yeah, there was some point where I was reading where there was some mention of a club, and I was like, it just sort of like snapped into focus. Like, oh yes, Ben is also talking about Switzerland.
So I think another thing, I think something that exacerbates all of those things is that this is a society in which the entire economy and culture are much more explicitly than in the real world based on social status and interactions, and the way that social status grows out of interactions. So so your parenting being insufficient is not just a matter of people being critical of you, but it might actually disrupt your entire like result in your family being taken apart.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, which is true.
Which is true.
In the real world, yes,
right. So in the real world, for
so
marginalized people, that is very much true, that
yes,
the opinion of society about your parenting can take away your children.
Absolutely.
But yeah, blown out of, like, made like that writ large as a general rule, and in fact, that is the entire economy is what other people think of you.
Yeah,
that's very much in the sort of. I keep wanting to like trace conversational threads to other texts, right? So I think I first encountered that sort of idea with Cory Doctorow's Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, where he had the concept of Wuffy. And then Udunjaya Vijayaratna's first book, which I'm going to blank on the title of, but also sort of took that and ran it further. And there was a Black Mirror episode that did the same, this idea that everything you have is based on social capital and it could crash. And, I mean, I feel like we exert that all the time with things like Kickstarter these days, right? I mean, this podcast was funded in part by Kickstarter, which is, people give us money because they trust us to do good things with it, essentially, right? And, the only way you can run successful Kickstarters, especially more than one, is if you continue to maintain sufficient social capital to persuade people to invest in you, right? And that's not new to Kickstarter. If I go back to, I don't know, to the village that my parents grew up in, right? Like, how do you get someone to, invest in anything? It's all about social capital, right? And I guess I kind of feel like the old world really ran on that, and we kind of got away from it for a little while, and now maybe it's being reinvented.
The book so a couple of
texts. I think where I first encountered this idea is the same places where Cory encountered the idea before he wrote Down and Out of the Magic Kingdom, which we both encountered because it was a big hit in geek circles at the time, which is Eric S. Raymond's The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which is sort of like viewing the open source movement, which at the time was in its heyday of like, this will change the world, which, it did a bit, but as a gift economy and looking at it through the lens of, anthropological ideas of reputation economy, there's also, I think it's Lewis Hyde's The Gift, which is sort of the text that probably Raymond got that from, the classic like text about study of how gifting economies work and how they were fundamentally different than exchange economies. And the recent thing that I've read that really complexified that greatly and kind of blew my mind about it is Graeber's Debt the First 5,000 Years, which is an amazing book, which is sort of about how there are cycles of credit debt economies and monetary exchange economies, and sort of and one thing it does is it takes apart the sort of traditional naive economist's account of how money emerged, which is sort of like, well, people bartered, right? Like there was, I'll give you one sheep for two hens, and then then they realized, well, wouldn't it be more sensible if we had a standard medium of exchange, and then we got money, which is like not how it happened according to any historical or anthropological evidence. That's just what economists living in a market economy make up about, because in fact, like spot exchange, like barter, was originally pretty anomalous, because in fact, if you're asking someone about chicken, you weren't like, hey, I'm an unknown person, you're an unknown person, here's a pig, I want 3 chickens. You were like, I'm your aunt's sister's husband, and this and then, and we're deeply embedded in a network of relations. So most transactions are like, I'll give you a chicken because the last time I repaired your roof, but you're still mad at me about this thing. But on the other hand, you want my cousin to marry your cousin. And you know what I mean? Like it's not a antiseptic transaction in which goods are exchanged, right? Anyway, that's how most of the world worked. And what happened with capitalism, early capitalism, is that what used to be a relatively special case, which is like anonymous merchants from different towns meeting to exchange goods, became like the way the world worked, with all kinds of drastic consequences. Anyway, so I'm really interested in that. And The Guy Who Worked for Money is my story about that. That is a more recent, more near future story set like, in the 2050s in Frankfurt. It is about reputation economy taking over. And this world I wanted to be not quite a pure like classical Cathedral in the Bazaar reputation economy. I call it in some place a pride economy. And partly, say one last thing about this, which is, partly it seems to me like money is a crude mechanism for dealing with an information poor system. So essentially you're saying, we don't know anything about you except you have these banknotes. You know what I mean? Like that allows us to make a transaction and elide all the other stuff. That makes it very efficient, because before I'd have to know how I feel about your, you know what I mean? Like in the village economy, like there's all this information, rich information, and money it makes it possible for us to do a transaction even if I don't know who you are and how I feel about how my ancestors felt about your ancestors, or how, all the debts and internetwork between us. It's just like, oh, money, okay, good, we're good. And one thing I'm quite interested in is, how will this change when we have such a wealth of computation available for everything? So there's actually no reason why anybody in Fifth's world can't have the same level of knowledge that two people in the village who grew up together have about each other, even if they've never met and they're from opposite sides of the world, because it's all in the cloud and they could just run a really complicated algorithm and figure out everything that, you know what I mean? So it becomes scalable in a way that, it hasn't been, but is starting to be.
So that ties in with another topic that we were going to talk about, that requires this panopticon society that you've got.
Yeah.
So, Mary Anne, you want to talk about privacy?
Well, I want to define panopticon. So the panopticon was, just for people who aren't familiar, was this sort of prison concept, right? The idea that if you structured a prison, essentially if you imagine an amphitheater of cells with a tower in the center, you could have one guard in the center who could sort of swivel around and view all of the cells. The people in the cells couldn't see each other, right? So you need that kind of visual image. And the sort of brilliance of panopticon was you didn't even really have to put a guard in there, because the prisoners never knew if there was a guard or not. And so they had to assume that they were being watched at all times, right? So it was a very efficient surveillance method. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting who came up with it, but it,
Bentham.
Sorry?
Bentham, yeah. Jeremy Bentham.
So, I encountered it in Foucault, Discipline and Punish, where he has a chapter on that. And so, I found this aspect of your society terrifying. And I think and I think what's fascinating is that, and that is despite the fact that I live probably the most public, transparent life of anybody I know, right? I put I put much of my life on the internet in a variety of ways. I document my kids. I document all kinds of stuff that many people are more private about, right? And we've had Cory Doctorow. We've interviewed him. It's always interesting to me talking to Cory because he has these concerns about privacy that I mostly don't. I have the privilege of not needing to think about in my regular life. And every time I talk to him, I'm always a little also terrified, right? Like he brings back to me how much danger there is in being surveilled constantly by the government, by society, etc. So fifth in this, I don't think this is a spoiler to say that one of the central conflicts of the book is that fifth, like all the other childs in the world, has no privacy from their parents, right? And none, basically, including things like when fifth is, checking on a friend in the internet,
the equivalent
of the internet, right, to see what they're doing. Fifth has to think about the fact that their parents are probably one of the 9 parents, or many of them, is at that moment watching them watch this other person, right? Or can presumably review the logs later. Right?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
So going through the world assuming as a child that your parents know everything about you at all times.
For you, that must be particularly.
Oh my God. Is that not terrifying for everyone? It's terrifying for me.
I just meant because you have a specific.
And it's interesting because
for everyone.
I had a fraught relationship with my parents as a teenager. They came from a conservative village environment. Here we were in America. I was sleeping with white boys. I was scared they would find out. So I empathized with fifth greatly in much of that, right? So that was very effective. As a parent, I'm almost on the other side of it, right? Because I would say that Kevin and I have somewhat of a reputation among our friends' kids as being the laid back parents, right? We are very permissive in that sense, and we do not monitor them very much. And periodically we wonder whether we should be monitoring them more, right? And I do have the sort of, like the first time I let my daughter wander around town with a friend, I made her, when she was, I don't know, 10 or 11, the friend was a little older, I made her text me every 30 minutes, so I knew she'd still be alive.
Not dead.
Yeah. And she literally texted me, I'm not dead yet, over and over for the next couple hours. But I understand the urge to watch your kids all the time, but mostly I resist it. Right. So I don't know. I don't have a question here.
No,
that's my framing.
I'm definitely, I think.
So there's several things going on there. One is I'm definitely satirizing both of those things, both because it seems like, both because a thing that science fiction can do is to take this sort of emotion that we feel and like paint it in the broadest possible colors. Like, God, it feels like my parents are on my back. Really? Let's turn that up to 10. Like, what if your parents like that's part of the what if thing. And just it's fun. There's a lot of great comedy gold in writing an embarrassed adolescent whose parents are snipping on them, and like the degree to which Fifth's 9 parents are not only reading, are essentially like they can't read Fifth's thoughts. Although there's a bit like there's a bit where like there's a bit in the book where like for reasons which are part of the plot, Fifth ends up like publishing neural data. So they're not like reading minds like in the telepathy sense, but they can literally like look at a PET scan of like everything, and they're like, you see, Fifth's amygdala lights up every time we. Anyway, so there's a comedy aspect in how little in the plight of somebody with their privacy. Also, on the other hand, that is part of this whole analysis of the anxiety of parenting, the way that what we've turned parenting into, like the way that we see the world is full of dangers, and the way that we judge parents for not constantly monitoring their kids and keeping them from those dangers, leads to this, like, of course you would always want to watch your kid, like wherever they were, where are they? So those two impulses smashing against each other are very much part of the heart of it. The other thing I want to say is that Of course, it comes from the panopticon and from the world we live in. But in fact, so I want this both. On the one hand, it should be terrifying. It's meant to be terrifying. You're seeing, we're picking the person who is most aggrieved by this aspect of the society. And at the same time, it's a utopian idea. And the reason it's a utopian idea is that we live in a world where that surveillance is totally top down. It is only the mighty viewing the powerless. And Fifth's world is utopian in the sense that it is universal mutual public surveillance in which everybody sees everybody, except sort of, within their little sphere of privacy, but it's all sort of, kind of adjudicated and decided through essentially this highly algorithmatized gossip network, like well, your house is fine to be private, or this should be private for this purpose, or whatever. And there certainly is some class in this book, and there certainly are the more powerful and the less powerful, but it is arguably they're in a lot better shape than we are in terms of the distribution of the equity involved in the surveillance, because we literally only have the mighty surveilling the powerful, right? And we have it more and more all the time. And
so, in that sense, this is not really a panopticon situation, because, as Mary Anne noted, in the panopticon, the prisoners can't see each other, or sometimes even the guard. So in some ways, this is more closely related to, I hate to quote David Brin, but The Transparent Society by David Brin, which postulated or suggested the idea of, I don't know if he coined the term surveillance instead of surveillance, that everyone can be seeing everything, and that can be a terrifying idea, but it also does have the potential to level out the power structures, power differences.
Yeah, actually, I want to correct what I just said. I said it's only one way. It's not only one way, because, of course, in fact, they try to make it only one way, but there is a war going on. And in fact, everything from Rodney King to George Floyd is like, because now more people have cameras and the ability to publish that data, there is surveillance going on, and that has a profound effect.
So it makes me wonder, like what would happen to things like domestic violence if we had surveillance, right? Like all the bad behavior that people get away with in the privacy of their homes.
Yeah, and on the other hand, privacy is a good, and it is an enormous loss to lose it. So there's a real, so I wanted to engage with that in partly this satirical comical mode, in which, but also, tragicomic mode, in which, there's both suffering, but also it's estranged to an extent that we can kind of, it's an over-the-top version of a lot of these things that are happening. So.
All right. So I feel like
Did you think it was funny? This is a question I have, because a lot of time I think the book can be read in different ways, and it's actually on Amazon under humorous science fiction.
I think I was so stressed out by the way Fifth's parents were pressuring them, and the way all of society was pressuring Fifth to maintain the parents' reputation under threat of like family disillusion, that like like I was too emotionally caught up to well, find things funny like anymore. So
I like that too.
I think it was funny for a while, and then I got then
it got real.
Then it got real.
Pretty much what I was going for.
Yeah. Well, so I want to, before we go away from the parenting entirely, I just want to connect this to, we talked in an earlier episode about pain versus damage, and the extent to which you let your kids take risks where they might hurt themselves. And I think it was interesting because my sympathies were entirely with Fifth in the discussions with their parents, right? In terms of like, I'm going to go out on the surface, or I'm going to try and get to a place where I have a smidgen of privacy. But the book gives you the flip side a little bit with Thave, where you really see the argument for a lot of people are going to get hurt, and a lot of people are going to get damaged and, killed if you move away from control and the homeostasis, right?
Yeah, although Thave is really making that's interesting that can be taken away from the Thave scene, although, to be fair, Thave is making the opposite argument. Thave is saying you need to start loosening the stranglehold of consensus.
Well, Thave is now, right? but presumably for quite a long time beforehand was on the other side of it, right? And so I mean, so there's where I was in this sort of moment with Thave of like, that must be incredibly frightening. Right? Well, and this is like the prime directive argument too, right? Like if you have the power as, you're Kirk on the Enterprise and you see this primitive civilization doing damage to itself, destroying its environment, whatever it is, and you could step in and save them and help them or show them a better way, where is your, I mean, this is something Star Trek has wrestled with over and over and over again. And it's interesting to me because I think it comes down in different places with different shows, like Nemesis and different captains. But even with Picard, I think comes down in different places at different points in the series. So, and he's
well, and I sort of feel like, I mean, you have a far more encyclopedic knowledge of Star Trek than I do. I'm sure as soon as I say this, you will tell me lots of ways in which it has been done well. But from to the extent that I certainly, this text is engaged with some of the Star Trek I saw as a kid, and with Foundation, and Second Foundation, and with, which I find very attractive, the notion of being the outsider anthropologist who understands and arrives bringing wisdom and all. I would say that this isn't just in this book. I feel like this is more in the other stuff that, as I said, there was one story out, and there's some other stuff in the works that are more on Siab and Thave's view of the world. But I mean, like, partly, as I said, I'm like very interested in how the notion that it is Kirk's decision, because the prime directive is the only thing holding Kirk back, because of course they are a primitive society and Kirk does know the right answer, and would Kirk decide to violate the prime directive, the correct answer would be the correct answer, and the means would be the correct means. Like that all is,
I mean, that is Star Trek of 50 years ago, right? Like it, I mean, that's what I mean. Like it was a kind of, their position has evolved and problematized and gotten complicated, but I think where they are now is a little bit where I am now, which is, even if you don't assume superiority, right? I mean, that's one of the, when we talk post-colonial lit and Orientalism, one of the things we highlight is that there's this sort of assumption of superiority on the part of the West versus the East, right? But let's say you ditch that and it's just two civilizations interacting and one doesn't claim to be superior, but one might have the power to intervene, right? And the question of like, should you intervene to save people pain, to help people, to stop people from being killed? I mean, I feel like West Wing interrogated some of these questions with, the US and, various African countries at points where there were genocides going on. And this sort of question of, you have the power to go in and stop this. Should you? And, how do you decide when is the right point to intervene, right?
And unlike in a lot of fictional depictions of this, Thave is quite aware that they don't necessarily have the right answer, and that they might get it wrong, and probably will get it wrong.
Yeah. Like basically, yes. Siab and Thave spend a
lot of time getting it wrong.
It's interesting, right? Because my sympathies are generally with Thave, and I love that moment, but I also kind of walked away from it saying like, oh yes, and now I am turning into a mass murderer, right?
Well, and that's sort of like, that's something that comes up in that cycle of stories. That's not Thave's style, so it doesn't come up with Thave, but like that's one thing, is that I don't think this is a world in which, even though Siab and Thave are physically more powerful than the people on these planets, but like, you can't just like assassinate your way to a brighter future. Like that isn't even a lever that they know that's not even a lever you can pull. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, there is not any, that is
contra what Ian Banks might say in the
they're not wrestling with what George Bush was wrestling with. I mean,
it doesn't have to be just about the mass murder thing. I mean, I think, where this comes back to regular parenting is, like something I see a lot now in like the mom blogs. My daughter is, going to start high school shortly, right? So teenager, and there's a whole host of conversations happening in private about, to what extent one tries to control their sexuality, do you read their diary? Do you read their texts? Do you, do they have curfews? Do they, whatever it is, right? There's a whole host of things that are all kind of aimed at protection, right? You don't want these kids to, drinking and driving. I mean, it's not all about pregnancy either. It's about all kinds of teenage dangers when their brains are not fully developed yet, et cetera, so on. And they are going
do we still gonna have the episode about that?
We should have an episode about that, but so I know you disagree with this. I don't know a lot about it. So, but regardless, I would say they don't necessarily have a full understanding of what what the risks will.
You know more than they do. That's
on some level, and and it's your job when they're little to do things like keep them from crossing the street in front of cars, right? So,
yep.
Anyway,
well, that's what the pain damage distinction is for, right? The pain damage distinction is for, it's not you don't have perfect information, but the pain damage distinction is designed to know, to give you a bright line of when coercion is justified.
Well, but even, I guess I kind of feel like she's 14 at this point. I can tell her that I think this thing, it risks damage, but I don't know that I feel like I have the right to stop her at this point. In other societies, she would be getting married by now. She'd be an adult.
You're right. No, sure. And it depends what it is. But I think you would find, I think there's an interesting thing as they get bigger, right? Because it sort of scales from this initial thing where they're babies and you have to, you are 100% responsible for keeping them safe. They will literally die if you don't. Up through where, my daughter's 20, like she's an adult. She's home for, she's home for vacation. Like I do not have any legal or, but even with adults, like in extremis, you would, if she was addicted to heroin, I would stage an intervention. You know what I mean? Like the when do you intervene in some ways doesn't go away.
Right. But but I think it becomes less of a parenting question, right? Because I would do the same for a sibling, right?
Well, that's what I mean. It scales. That's what I mean by it scales. It starts out with you having this absolute disparity, and it ends up with them you having, if you do it right, you end up with the same relationship effectively that you have with some other family member who isn't, you know what I mean? Like you sort of graduate. On some level, never. On some level, it never goes away, right? On some level, but on a level of emotional support, it never goes away. But in terms of like intervening, but I don't know, but it's.
And I would say, and I'll highlight this as cultural, right? Like in Sri Lankan culture, you get referred to as like a boy or a girl until you get married. If you're not married at 40, you're still a boy, right? So
sure.
Where I draw the line is very different from where my parents would have drawn the line. So
yeah, I don't know. I feel like this is germane in the sense that, so I resisted the notion of Thave as parent of the planet because I think Thave would resist that notion. But I do feel like I am less interested in the question of I am circling your planet with big ray guns and have the power to stop your genocide by just zapping people. I am less interested in that question, and that does have something to do with the kind of parent that I am, right? Like in some sense, it's like the question of like, I could make things better with coercion. It seems like, really? Could you though? I don't know. My track record on that, not great. Like, you know what I mean? Like essentially, I feel towards, and I think that does inform it a lot because I think that Siab and Thave feel about the matter of coercing some planet to be more humane or better or not destroy their environment by like using their power to make them do it, much the same way that I feel about that towards my children, which is like, that is like not off the table because sometimes it's the least, sometimes abdication is worse, but clearly something has gone terribly wrong. And that is not gonna, as a long-term strategy, not gonna work. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I feel like, reading your kid's diary and telling them that they can't go out with that boy, I luckily was never in that position. So I'm not going to judge anybody who finds himself there because I am not saying I would not do that. But I'm saying if you end up there, like that is not a long-term strategy, right? Like, you have to dig yourself out of that hole and get back to a place where you have a mutual sense of trust and where they're going to, make use of your advice as autonomous ethical beings who act responsibly. Like that's the end state. Yeah, I'm not judging anybody. I mean, God knows my kids were there were many tangles and there were many cul-de-sacs in which we were not in this, but clearly the fundamental question is not should I coerce them into being better, because you can't coerce them to being better. Coercion is like your backstop for you fucked up, worst possible scenario,
I mean, I will say I don't want to give people
the victory condition is only ever forging a partnership.
Yeah. I mean,
you know what I mean?
I don't want to give the impression that I never tell my kids to do stuff either, because I do, right? Like, so I think about things like there are points in which you're trying to instill some sort of discipline. So, like currently, hopefully my kids aren't embarrassed by this, but currently we have an ongoing debate about whether one needs to shower or bathe daily. And, and
right.
especially, we've been remote for a long time. So things got a little slack for the last year. And now they're going back to school and, with other people.
Certain social norms must be reintroduced.
That's right.
We actually exited the state of noble savagery.
That's right. So
state of nature.
So now, I've set a timer on Alexa to remind everyone it's time to go take your shower, and sometimes I do have to apply a little pressure to get that to happen.
Oh my God, the hair combing. Tell me about it.
I mostly gave up on hair combing, but I'm like, clean is all I ask.
This is off the topic of the Unraveling, but I have a great hair combing story about Noah, which I think he'd be okay with me telling, which is that at some point Noah was really not, it was a real struggle around hair, and he has really long hair. Like Noah has super long hair. He just hasn't cut his hair except for trimming it to remove loose ends since he was 10 or something. So at some point when he was much younger, he was more like 5th grade or something, he would just fight tooth and nail about combing his hair. And this is the kind of thing where I was trapped in a mode of negotiating or bribing or threatening, or you won't get to do this or whatever. And at some point was able to step out of that mode. And we were playing RuneQuest, and RuneQuest is a tabletop role-playing game system that everything is percent, so it's a D100 system. So there's as you level up in individual skills individually. It's not like you're a 3rd level fighter. You just have a 52% in poleaxe. Each skill is atomic. And so I was like, oh, this is how this works. There is a minimum and there's a bunch of stuff in RuneQuest where it's to be an initiate, you have to have a 30% in this skill, and to be a Rune Lord, you have to have a 80%. So I was like, no, you have to have a hair maintenance skill. The level length that your hair has the longer it is, the greater the hair maintenance skill level that you have to have in order to, you know what I mean? I put it in RuneQuest terms, and I was like, so we just have to make sure that you acquire, you either have to one or the other. You have to shorten the hair or increase the hair maintenance skill, and these are the ways you level up in that skill. Anyway, so then it worked. Once he was on board with that project, it worked great. But
I'll also say the other thing that leaps to mind is that at times we have controlled their access to technology. Not very much, not nearly as much as most parents I know do. And it doesn't feel, I would say we're mostly trying to do it in the same way we try to do it with ourselves. And we're just modeling for them. So it's, no devices an hour before bed because the light, messes with your sleep systems. Or this game is designed to be incredibly addictive. We've now spent 8 hours clicking on this clicker game, and is that really what you wanted to spend your Saturday doing? So, but occasionally we will do things like just turn off the Wi-Fi for the at the router. Yep. Nobody gets internet because we're spending too much time on it, right? So, so I don't know. Sorry, that's maybe.
No, that was also one of our tactics too. Is sometimes we would be we are imposing this on all of us. If we can't all as a community manage this resource responsibly, then okay, nobody gets internet. You know what I mean? That, which is sort of let's either work out a consensus deal about how we all, which, that's not everybody. There's a million. I am not preaching any one parenting style. There's plenty of people who are far more directive, and it works great because it's a fit for their kids. And some families we have gone on vacation with have been frustrated by the fact that the Rosenbaum family will have like a 3-hour meeting to determine the rules for going forward, because it's a consensus-based system. But it's not really. I mean, it's as much of a consensus-based system as I can manage. But I don't know. I mean, now it's kind of 100% consensus-based system, really. Like, they're big, so I feel actually pretty good that we put in all those hours, because it's scaled. We have a system that still works now that they're 17 and 20, which
So I would like to note that we have been going for a while, and that it would be
no longer talking about the book at all.
No. So I wonder if we could.
No, let's wrap back to the book. I think I've hit most of the main things I wanted to hit. I think, Jed, you wanted to talk about structure and setting, right? So
yeah, I guess I didn't want to talk about structure and setting in general, but two particular things. Mm-hmm. One is that I was surprised when I got to the end of the book and found back matter of various sorts, appendices explaining various things about the world building that I had been confused or uncertain about. So I guess there's kind of a general question, but also a specific one about this book, about how to signal that to readers that there is useful material at the back, and also sort of the question of why you put it there. Just as one example, and this is what I was thinking about setting, that I wasn't really clear while I was reading about what the physical setting of the book was. I kind of thought it was habitats floating in space, and then eventually I figured out that maybe they were underground and hollow world, and I wasn't entirely clear, and then the back matter made that clear. So I've also seen other books that have dramatis personae or family trees at the start, or sometimes a glossary at the end, and I just wanted to hear about how you make these choices and what led you to put that material where you did.
The background stuff was a relatively late addition. I mean, there's lots of stuff that I had internally as notes. There's probably as many words of notes as there are. Easily as many words of notes as there are of the novel. But I was not really necessarily planning to expose it all, but that sort of came up in conversations with Liz. I mean, I feel like, oops, like, I mean, it's supposed to be signaled at the beginning that there's stuff at the end. I think there's a bit, but it'd be easy to scroll past. I think there's a bit that's like at the end. I think it's a sort of table of contentsy thing that says like page 300, dramatis personae. So, but everybody's gonna engage in a different way.
I'll note I didn't read the back matter. I stopped when I saw there was...
Right. I mean, and that answers the question of why it's at the end, is that if you are like really interested in the details of the world building and you want to, but it's not really germane to the central thrust of the story. Like if what you care about is Fifth's emotional arc, it doesn't really matter when the excavation of, Full Belly, like how many thousands of years before present. I think of that stuff. I mean, I liked that stuff when I was a kid, right? I liked all the little, weird back matter things, maps and glossaries and things. But I loved that in, there's some great stuff in like Gideon the Ninth and Harrow the Ninth, to note recent books, where there's like some cool back matter stuff where she's totally having a lot of fun with it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's at the end because it's for the people who really want to dig into that.
Fair enough.
I mean, when I wrote Bodies in Motion, it's, lots of complicated family stuff. So I had written some genealogies, trees for myself to keep it straight while I was writing. And I think I threw them in the back, and my publisher said, oh no, we need to put this in the front because this is very confusing and people will want to reference it as they're reading. And I was like, but it gives things away. Like there were spoilers essentially. But she felt strongly about it. So we did it. And she was justified. My own sister said, those were really helpful. I would have had trouble keeping track otherwise. So I think that where you put that material is kind of, you put it in the front if it is going to be important to parsing the book. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. It's a hard book to parse, but on the other hand, I'm not sure it would be. I'm dubious that a lot of the stuff that's in the back would necessarily make it easier, because it's another rabbit hole full of like complexity, and I don't know. So yeah, I mean, you take a bet. I mean, I think my gut feeling is that the way that the reader is taught to read this book is by starting with Fifth at 5 years old, where Fifth doesn't know very much about the world, and to see everything through Fifth's eyes, and then the insertion of various interstitial documents, so that you are, gaining an understanding of the world at roughly the rate that Fifth is, and that, and I think that does sacrifice certain technical details, like you you could be forgiven for not understanding that they're in an excavation which is beneath the surface of Fu, even though they go up to the surface in the second chapter. But
that confused
but it
me.
could be the surface of.
I didn't know what surface it was.
Yeah. Anyway, but you know what I'm saying? Like, so obviously some of that is it privileges a view from the point of view of the subjective point of view of the main character's interiority. That's why that stuff's in the back. Okay, but for listeners of the podcast, it's in the back. So if you find yourself confused about where they are physically, check the back.
Yeah. Okay. I could talk about this forever, but I think that is. I think we've hit most of the main points that I wanted to discuss. Jed had some other topics that he mentioned: translation, religion, fan fiction, all super relevant. But we've been talking, Ben, for 2 hours, so we should probably wrap this up.
Yeah.
But any last things you want to note for the readers? So when this airs, the book will have just come out, so they can rush out and get it. If they want to know more about your writing or the world,
BenjaminRosenbaum.com, I guess. I mean, about the world, yeah. Well, and in the show notes, we should put the Asimov story, which is set in the same universe. Actually, Droplet is set in the same universe, which was published in 2002 or something in fantasy and science fiction. But yes, anyway, so.
Yes. Do I still get to take credit for this entire universe because?
Oh yeah, you do.
Yay!
The entire universe is because of Mary Anne's theme anthology proposal.
Yes, which I was editing Aqua Erotica and I was looking for water-related erotica stories, and Ben sent me the story Droplet, which I loved.
It wasn't called Aqua Erotica yet; it was called Bodies of Water.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
And
that's why the story contains literal bodies of literal water. But anyway, yes.
This came up in your discussion in the first episode of How You Met, because you were talking about.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
So see the show notes for that episode for more on that.
Well, I think that the gist of it is that this went on to become. I didn't take it because it wasn't erotica, right? So I thought it wasn't erotica.
Right.
So
and hence here we are today.
And so it became all of
20 years later.
So all right, thank you so much, everybody. Hope you enjoy. Everyone should go out and read this fabulous novel, The Unraveling. I think it's going to be really important. I mean, in addition to being very engaging and a terrific read.
Buy it, read it. If you liked it, review it.
Yes, please review it. It. Tell your friends.
Go review it on Goodreads and Amazon and whatnot.
Nominate it for awards.
Yes, all the places. Well, if this doesn't get a Tiptree, I'll eat my hat. No, but
I will be nominating
Kane and Hora. Don't invoke. You're calling the evil eye.
Okay. Well, it'll certainly be nominated. So we don't know what else is coming out this year, but
slightly smaller evil eye.
That's right. Well, we know it'll be nominated because Jed and I are nominating it. So that's clear. Anyone can nominate for the Tiptree. So
the Otherwise Award.
The Otherwise Award.
That's right.
That's right. It changed.
That's right.
So
now known as the Otherwise Award.
Now known as the Otherwise Award. So all right.
Don't jinx it.
This book is very otherwisey, though. I have to say, just as in terms of in everything is otherwise, right? In terms of you spun all the dials, right? As you said. So
I did try and spin all the dials.
All right.
Thanks so much for talking to me. It was lovely to be on your podcast.
Yay!
Thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, Darius the producer here. If this episode got you excited to read The Unraveling, you can head on over to erewhonebooks.com to purchase Ben's book and find out more. The link will be in the description. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, subscribe, follow, and share it with your friends. We won't say no if you leave us a 5-star rating as well. It really does help with the almighty algorithm. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at MRAH Podcast, where we post updates of new episodes. This podcast is hosted by Mary Anne Mohanraj and Benjamin Rosenbaum. Our guest today was Jed Hartman. Editing and show notes by Darius Finisar. Music composed by Thor Bremer. And cover art by Stephanie Bailey. Thanks for tuning in to Mohanraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans.